Okay, let's do this again. So, welcome to this workshop. My name is Dr. Isabel Souza. Thank you so much for joining. I really hope we have a good time. I think you will enjoy this presentation. And without any further ado, let me get us on PowerPoint mode so that we can get started. And I can go ahead and share what I have to share. So, welcome again. Today's presentation is the 40-hour conundrum. It's time for us to take interpreter education to the next level. And that is what I'm going to be talking about today. So, let's think about, first of all, who am I? Maybe you haven't seen me before. My name's Dr. Isabel Souza. I have been working in the field of translation and interpreting since 1981. So I guess you could consider me a bit of a dinosaur. I actually started off as a translator for many years and then started working as an interpreter. I've been really in all fields. I actually started as a religious interpreter, interpreting simultaneously for sermons, and they can be quite lively. And I've just run the gamut with court interpreting, conference interpreting, medical interpreting, and I've done a lot of advocacy for the field in many roles. Currently, I volunteer as a treasurer of Critical Link International, a great nonprofit that represents all medical, legal, and social work interpreters across the world. And, you know, I have taught interpreters for probably the last 15 years in several organizations. So, you know, I'm not saying all this just to toot my horn, but basically by having this long-term view of the field, I think I have some perspective that others who've just entered perhaps don't know. So maybe this will be a bit of a history lesson as well. So let's start by talking about, are we satisfied with our current working conditions as interpreters? You know, have your rates gone up since you started in the field? Do you feel like they're going down? Is the competition increasing? Are you finding it hard to keep up with all the burdens of freelance work and with some of the losses of, you know, some states now are taking away, you know, transportation compensation, and you know, we're getting into a gig economy, which we've always been, but you know, there have been some differences. Do you think we're being valued by the public, by those that we work with? So, you know, think about that. I want us to really focus on where we are and what we can do, because advancing the profession, you know, is a lot harder than it seems. For every 2 steps forward, we have a step backward, and it is a fight, and we have to stay vigilant. And that is one of the messages: stay vigilant and take action. Now, why do you think that is? I really believe, and I'm going to make a case, that it's because our benchmarks are too low. We have gone to this paradigm where the lowest common denominator dictates our benchmarks. Now, I'm not talking about standards, okay? Standards are what we commit to follow. We have wonderful standards of practice. We have, you know, ethical standards that we hold on to. But that's one thing. I'm talking about benchmarks. Benchmarks is where the reality lies, and things that we can measure, you know? So when I think about benchmarks, I think about what the current conditions are for the profession. The reality is that in this profession, all we need to get into it is, for medical interpreters at least, a minimum 40-hour training. That's the benchmark of training. Educationally, for general education, we need a GED or higher, right? We need to have at least 2 languages. But to what level? It's rarely stated, okay? And sometimes we'll see, you know, in a job offer, we'll see certification preferred or certification a plus, but it's rarely required, right? It will be, but you know, not yet. And why do we think it's so low? Do you have any ideas? Because it is low. It's lower than so many other professions. I mean, even to be a yoga instructor, you need at least 200 hours of instruction. And usually the patient safety risks are much lower with a yoga instructor. Cosmetology requires more. I mean, there's so many professions. Even being a hairdresser requires more than this. And nothing against these professions, they're great professions, but we all know that interpreters, you know, who are not able to do the job can have dire consequences for the clients. So the reason I think it's so low is because of the naysayers, right? So there's always going to be naysayers in the field. We have folks that will say, oh, we can't require more training because people won't have money to do more training. Oh, we can't have a bachelor degree because some people don't have bachelor degrees. And they're such nice interpreters. They're good interpreters. And while that's all true, that's something I heard. I heard in the 80s and 90s, oh, we can't have a 40-hour course. A lot of people were against 40-hour courses, believe it or not. Because back in the day when everything started in the 80s, interpreter education was a workshop. All you could find is a workshop here, a workshop there. What we now consider CEUs and continuing education workshops, that's all there was back in the day. And people were against courses. They said that interpreters wouldn't have the money, interpreters didn't have the time. It's the same things we hear when we talk about, you know, higher standards. There's always the issue of, you know, what about those that we're going to leave behind? Well, we don't have to leave anybody behind. But we also have to ensure patient safety. What about those that don't pass the language proficiency exam? Well, maybe they don't speak enough of the language to be able to interpret correctly. All they have to do is get to that level and they can go interpret. I'll never forget when I started working as a court interpreter, you needed a bachelor to get court certified back in Massachusetts. This was in the early 90s. And, you know, as much as I disliked it, it was exactly what I needed to get my bachelor's and finally move on. And I would have never thought that if it weren't for that higher benchmark in court interpreting, I wouldn't have a bachelor, I wouldn't have gotten my master's in education, I wouldn't have a PhD. So benchmarks are there to help us, you know, by raising them, we're actually helping interpreters to raise their own standards. So all I have to say is I could have seen it as a problem, I could have seen it as a solution. And it helped me tremendously. So higher standards can actually be helpful, higher benchmarks. So, you know, are we hiring, you know, bona fide professionals? Language and communication professionals, or are we hiring technicians, right? So is the lowest common denominator one that we can say is really for a professional? Those are hard questions, but we need to really, you know, think about them. Okay? So let's think about what I'm going to talk about next. I'm actually going to give you some examples. Okay, I don't want you to just go by my word. Research-based instruction is what we need in our interpreting educational system. Everything you hear, have the instructor back it up. Opinions are not facts, right? So I can say all these things, but unless I prove it to you, how do you know? So I went ahead and I did a little bit of research and I looked at Indeed.com and I checked out what some of the requirements were, and let's see this one right here. Get my face out of the way. So medical interpreter at Health First Family Center, requirements. Required qualifications. Fluency in English and foreign languages required, both oral and written. It doesn't really say to what level, who's testing. It says initial evaluation. Well, hospitals or healthcare centers are hardly experts. Even interpreters are not experts at evaluating fluency. So it really should be a third-party testing, not somebody who wants to hire you, who's going to see if your English is good enough, okay? And maybe you speak a real language, so now there's a real incentive. It's a conflict of interest. We all know that. Number 4, minimum of a high school diploma or GED or equivalent. Associate degree or bachelor's preferred. While this is beautiful that they prefer to have more and that they're not limiting anyone, the pay grade of this position is going to be based on that educational level right there. So because it doesn't require a bachelor or equivalent, basically that position will never, no matter how many years you work in that organization, will never be able to go up to the next pay grade. It's just how the system works. I didn't invent it. You didn't invent it. It is how it is. So it also says, medical interpreter certification or membership in an association, a plus. Well, that's nice that they mentioned that, but you don't need either. Proof of interpreter training, minimum of 40 to 60 hours. Okay, so out of everything we see here, the only thing that they really would require proof of is your educational level and your interpreting level. And the reason it says 40 to 60 is because some 40-hour programs have gone on to become 50-hour programs or 60-hour programs. Let's look at the next example because research can't be based on one example. And my beautiful little cat likes to join me for my presentations. So the next one here is a Portuguese medical interpreter. It requires fluency, must have at least 2 to 5 years of community medical interpreting experience, certification, preferred but not required, and credential in training. So it's interesting, they call the training a credential. Credentialed in medical interpreting, 40 hours. So again, the fluency doesn't explain what level of fluency, and the credential, we're talking about training, right? So let's see one more. Wow, this one here, Spanish medical interpreter. This one here basically has no requirements. I mean, literally, you don't even have to have an interpreting experience. It basically just says 1 year prior experience in a healthcare environment. So you could be a receptionist in a healthcare environment, and boom, you're working as an interpreter tomorrow. So that is low. That's lower than the lowest denominator in my book. Now let's look at this one here. So it's a national interpretation agency looking for contract. Ideal candidates must be fluent. I don't know how you could do interpreting without being fluent in English and another language. Again, it's requesting pretty much nothing other than that. So if you speak 2 languages, you're in. Experience, it puts a year preferred, medical interpreter preferred. Again, you don't even have to be a medical interpreter. So, that's the law of the land right now. Another one here, this one's ASL. I needed to get ASL so we could do a bit of comparison. Experience as an interpreter in a variety of situations, completed a training program affiliated with a state accredited educational institution. So that's more than just a 40-hour training. And one of the following, you need to have certification by RID, interpreter or transliterator, and you need to have a general proficiency certificate, and they're talking here of the language proficiency, American Sign Language, at level 3 awarded by the NAD or the EIPA at a level of 4.0. Now here we're getting more specific. So you need to be either certified or have the fluency. It's still not a lot, but it's a little bit better. Okay, and our last example, this one here is another sign language. This one requires a bachelor degree in ASL and a state license certification or credential. Well, out of everything we've seen, this is the only one that's really looking for a professional level employment. It doesn't even list the rate. It says competitive pay, superior medical coverage, but you can already guess the pay is going to be a little bit more than what we've seen so far. So now that I've cleared that up, the standards have something to say about this. Oops. So the National Council of Standards for Training have talked about the contents. And I apologize for the typo there. Page 9 to 15 is the area that talks about the content. Okay, now the council standards are really more guidelines for instructors on how to teach medical interpreting, what to teach, and so forth. I'm focusing this presentation on medical interpreting, but it really goes for all interpreting that, you know, we need higher educational standards. Now, it doesn't involve any kind of accreditation program, and I say it's more of a guidelines because these standards are not measurable. And in order, standards in the essence of the term really need to be measurable. It lists 51 knowledge and skills areas, and of course some are areas with sub-areas. I just counted them all to give you sort of a picture. And you know, a knowledge area might be knowing about HIPAA and what that means and how it affects interpreters. A skill area would obviously be sight translation or consecutive interpreting, intervening in a communicative encounter, and so forth. It doesn't specify or suggest any specific time of instruction, okay? So CMIE stands for the Council of Medical Interpreting, Commission for Medical Interpreting Education. It's basically a division of the IMIA, the International Medical Interpreters Association. And on slides 24 to 30, it lists the knowledge areas and the skill areas that should be included in all medical interpreting programs. Now, it does include an optional accreditation process, meaning that it's not mandated by any law, but any training organization that teaches medical interpreting can get audited by CMIE and actually you know, be reviewed. Everything from all the marketing materials to the instructional materials to the level of fairness. It's very similar to a certification accreditation, but it's an instructional accreditation. It was based on the sign language accreditation system. And, you know, that one does mention that a program shall have a minimum of 40 hours, but it actually notes that as of January 16, 60 hours would be required for accreditation. And out of those 60, 30 would have to include medical terminology. And as of January of this year, since this presentation is in 2020, 80 hours are required to get accredited. So any program that wants to get accredited by CMIE actually needs to have 80 hours. So contrary to, you know, organizations who have, you know, a list of 40-hour programs that are accepted by certification bodies, the IMIA doesn't, you know, accept them as an accreditable program unless they increase. And the reason for the medical terminology being a large component is that when the needs assessment was done for national certification back in January of 2009, what happened is that we found that interpreters were really lacking knowledge of medical terminology, and that was a real patient safety issue. So not only weren't they prepared, they really needed more medical terminology. And when you think about it, any university credit course on medical terminology is a minimum of 30 hours itself. So anything less really just doesn't do justice to the interpreter. And interpreters need to have a really decent amount of medical terminology knowledge in 2 languages at a minimum, several specialties, at least the, you know, the top 100 terms of that specialty. And we're talking a lot of specialties because the interpreter can't really prepare. You know, you're jumping from oncology unit all the way to med surg, and then you're rushing to the emergency room. So, you know, as much as you take notes and and have tools, you really have to be familiar with a lot of terminology. And that's why the National Board exam actually includes quite a bit of terminology in the exam. Now, community interpreter programs that have a medical interpreting component have to devote at least 40 hours of instruction in the medical context. And if they don't, they have to include a medical terminology course in addition to that community interpreting program. So CMIE acknowledges that community interpreting programs exist, not that many, but they have to have a decent enough medical interpreting component to really be accreditable. So that's what the standards have to say about, you know, content of instruction and time frame. What do the studies have to say about it? So we have, according to a seminal study that was conducted by Dr. Flores in 2003, everybody's familiar with this because this was the study that really coined the terms we still use to this day on the major types of errors for interpreting. Especially in the medical interpreting world, this is used all the time. However, now we know if you're focusing on research that, you know, there are a lot more interpreting errors other than these, but these are still the ones that are being taught mostly. Unless you're going for a more academic training, you're not going to hear about the other errors. Flores' subsequent study in 2012 actually showed that medical interpreters who have at least 100 hours of training made a lot fewer mistakes overall. And these mistakes obviously, you know, made fewer errors, right? These errors that affect patient safety diminish. And I'm quoting exactly here, these findings suggest that requiring at least 100 hours of training for interpreters may have a major impact on reducing interpreter errors and their consequences in healthcare, while improving quality and patient safety. So, you know, this was done back in 2012. It's been shown in many different conferences. This is not new, but a lot of instructors are not necessarily attending the conferences and are not reading the research, I'm sorry to say. Not every instructor is doing that. So did anybody pay attention? Well, you know, apparently not, because this was 8 years ago. And we haven't seen that many 40-hour programs change. And, you know, I don't want to be doomsday, but it's something that we need to think about. So, who's doing it right? Okay, so we have several organizations that are actually doing a lot. And in the last 20 years, I can tell you for a fact that the university programs that are offering medical interpreting certificates has increased dramatically, actually. Many of them are language specific. They're really trying hard to offer programs that, you know, range anywhere between 150 and 200 hours, the majority of them. They're becoming more popular. And who do you think employers prefer? I mean, really. I happened to be one back in the day when I worked at Cambridge Health Alliance. For a few years, I worked as the manager of the interpreters department there. And, you know, if somebody shows up with a 40-hour certificate and somebody came up with a certificate from Boston University, who do you think I was going to hire? I mean, it was a no-brainer. And interpreters know that. But sometimes, you know, they want to take the shortcuts and it ends up biting them in the end, because you're just not as competitive with a 40-hour program as you can be with a, you know, a certificate that is academic on your resume. It's just a hard comparison. You can look at the educational programs. Again, I got to back it up. What I say has to be backed up. So go check it out for yourself. The IMIA Educational Registry lists several organizations. The ATA Educational Registry also lists a lot of them. And these are the ones that list the programs to become an interpreter. I'm not talking about CUs here. I'm talking about how do you become an interpreter? You have to really check those programs. These university typically they're one-year based programs, usually 3 to 5 courses. Many of them include internships or practicums, which is what we should call them in the healthcare field. And I'm just listing a few here, but there's so many. Some of them are now online, which is great, making it more accessible to everybody. There's also a Bachelor of Interpreting at the University of Arizona. And now there's also a Master's in Science in Healthcare Interpreting at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And that one happens to be 330 hours. So, you know, if you have 30 hours or 40 hours of instruction, it just doesn't compare. But if you have a bachelor, wouldn't it be nice if you could do a master's instead of just doing a college certificate that many times doesn't even include credits? So with a master's, you know, you can command more. So I'm sure in the future, I know they're thinking of doing, this is for sign language interpreting. They will be adding spoken language interpreting, let you know as soon as they do. It's the future. I mean, there's no way about it. Every profession, as it advances, and our profession is about 40 years old. Some could argue that a little bit more, but really 40 years is just about the mark. You know, by year 50, believe me, we're going to have more bachelors, we're going to have, you know, other degrees, because people will, the competition really demands it, and education is one of the manners in which we advance. There's some more good examples, okay? MITIO, the Medical Interpreting and Translation Institute Online, is a private educational organization. So we can't just say, well, they're universities, you know, we're private, we can't do that. We can't compete with them. Well, it's not true, they can. They offer an online 160-hour diploma, which is a 5-course program, but now they offer really 200 hours, with the last course being optional. Instead of 2 medical terminology courses, now they're offering a 3rd advanced one for those interpreters that want it. They can do it at any time. And you know, this also has a sister program for medical translation. So there are some private organizations that are doing it. Canada launched a program for community interpreters at 5 colleges. Actually, now it's just 6. That requires 180 hours. Now, of course, it's community interpreting, but they do require a separate 40-hour medical terminology course for anyone who wants to specialize in medical terminology. So, medical interpreting, I mean. So, you know, there are a lot of countries doing this. In Japan, you know, Osaka University has a medical interpreting program similar to this. I mean, there are many colleges abroad as well. It's not just in the US. Actually, abroad, you know, it's very hard to work as an interpreter without a bachelor or master's degree. They're quite confused when they see that in the United States, the training requirements are so long. So what about sign language interpreter education, right? I like to always compare. I don't talk only about spoken language. I talk about all interpreters, and that includes sign language. Well, they went through a major educational shift, okay? And we have so much to learn from them, okay? And in 2003, at an RID conference in Chicago, the membership passed a motion. And the motion was to require a bachelor degree to stand for future certifications. They did this motion in 2008, but they only required it, it was only going to be required in 2000. I'm sorry, they did the motion in 2003, but would only require it in 2012. So they did this in a way so that by 2008, you would have to have a minimum of associates, and by 2012, you would have to have a minimum of a bachelor. So they did it in a 2-tier program because some people didn't even have an associate's, right? And I think we're in that boat when you have everything under the sun. So the deadlines were widely publicized, and the Certification Council established an equivalent alternative criteria in lieu of education, right? When you say bachelor or equivalent, you have to have the equivalent. What is the equivalent? Life experience, professional experience, years of academic education, not totally in a formal degree. So maybe you did, you know, 1,000,000 credits, but you didn't have a bachelor. That was my case. I actually went to 15 universities before I got my bachelor. I was all over the place. It's just, I guess I'm a gypsy. I've lived everywhere you can imagine. And I was constantly moving. It's a little bit hard to get a degree that way. But they would have given me the equivalent if I had been a sign language interpreter. So there's always ways for those individuals that really have, or maybe you have 20 years experience in the field. And there's a mathematical formula for that in all that universities follow. And when you go to get a bachelor, you need a master's, you need a bachelor, but they always have the equivalent. So universities have a certain number of years of work experience in the area that qualifies as 1 year educational experience and so forth. So, you know, this is something for us to think about in the future. Of course, you know, this is really just talking about how 40 hours is not enough, but I'm just giving you a bit of a, you know, this is something we can learn from them. And, you know, 75% of most educational programs are offered at the associate's level, but they're never going to disappear, and that's wonderful. So it's not meant to be, you know, let's get rid of private interpreter education. No, not at all. If you might become the preferred manner of education so long as it is really appropriate. And in this case, you know, they really wanted more education in order to raise the level. And we know that this worked because from 2003, when they made this decision, until 2020, sign language interpreters are making more than they did in 2003. I'm not sure we can say that for spoken language interpreters. I can tell you that back in the 90s, I was making $70 an hour for a 3-hour minimum to go to Tufts Medical Center in Boston. Now that's unheard of. So things have changed, unfortunately, not for the best. So what is the 40-hour conundrum? Why have I set this up to really explain this? And, you know, I talked about the low benchmarks and I showed you the standards and the studies. And what's happening is that we're talking one talk, right? The standards are saying one thing, you know, the associations are saying we're professionals. Many of our advocates and many of our champions are saying, you know, of course, interpreting is a very highly skilled profession. That's what we're saying, but we're walking a different walk. And even instructors are saying this, but then when it comes to the, you know, let's get registered, what we're doing is not what we're saying. So our profession is actually split. That's how I see it. Our profession is split. Our head is going in one direction, our tail is going in another. And we really need to unite those two parts. United, we're going to be a much stronger profession. We need to walk the talk, right? And I'm really calling everybody to it. This is going to trigger a lot of people, all of those ideas, you know, but it doesn't mean it's not good. Nobody's saying 40-hour programs are not teaching to the best of their ability. Actually, they're doing miracles. They're doing miracles with the time they have. But it's almost an impossible job in my mind. So, you know, we really can't be saying we're bona fide professionals on one side and then on the other, you know, 40 hours and self-determined fluency gets you in. Or sometimes not, absolutely no requirement gets you in. And you start working as an interpreter. You just can't have it both ways. And what's happening is that the walk is dictating, you know, what's going to happen. So we're at a crux. We're at a time where if we don't shift and unite, you know, and decide, are we a profession or are we a technical job? If we don't decide that, the market's going to decide it for us. And it already has a preference. The lower the better, right? It's easier to find employees. That's why a lot of language companies are a little bit reticent. Many were against certification. Many are against all these things because they really don't want to have it harder. You know, they're going to have a harder sell. What they don't realize is that if they have a professional service, they're going to be able to charge more to their clients, and then they're going to be able to pay us more. But right now, they're charging as if we were customer service reps. You know, it's really unfortunate. And a lot of times they are hiring bilingual employees or bilingual individuals who have no idea about the field, because if they want to hire us professional interpreters, we're going to charge more. So they'd rather hire them, train them real quick, and then move on. So unfortunately, it is the name of the game. Their incentive is profits. Now, what is a course? A course is an educational engagement where you learn a skill or a knowledge. It's a series of lessons in a subject or skill, right? A program is different. A program usually encompasses several courses, which combined create a program. It can be an academic, a training, or a vocational program. Now, you know, we know that the interpreter education right now is more geared towards the training and the vocational side. We do have many programs that are now in the academic world. There's still, the majority are nonprofit. It's going to take a little while before that really becomes truly academic, because these are in the usually the Center for Professional Studies, even language professionals that study literature and language teaching, which is what dominates the language departments in universities. They actually look down on translators and interpreters because they think we're technicians. But that's changing, and many of them are incorporating translation and interpreting as part. But a lot of it is politics. It's academic politics. Trust me, you don't want to know. So, having explained all this, is a 40-hour comprehensive program even possible? So, it's really an oxymoron. First of all, because there's nothing comprehensive about what you can learn in 40 hours. It's barely an introduction. It's an introductory course. And a program is not a course. And these 40-hour courses are being called programs when they're really just one course. Now, an oxymoron is something that doesn't make sense. It's also called cognitive dissonance, right, in our field. And I thought this picture really said it nicely. You just can't have it both ways. And why do you think people are calling these programs 40-hour or 60-hour comprehensive programs? Well, why aren't they changing? Why aren't they increasing? I have a theory. Have I convinced you that 40 hours is not enough? You know, I don't know about you, but I don't care how you do the math. If you start thinking about those 51 or 31 or 40 topics and skills, how you're going to teach them in 40 hours. We should all have a practicum of at least, 5 hours. We should practice interpreting, actual consecutive interpreting, at least 30 hours perhaps, or 5 or 2. I mean, how many hours does it take? The majority of the 40-hour programs are modeled in the 15-hour knowledge instruction, 30-hour knowledge, or 25-hour knowledge, and 15 or 10-hour practice. And the 15-hour practice is in a group setting. You're not interpreting for 15 hours. You're not practicing 15 hours. You're practicing for a small portion of that. Most of the time you're listening to other people interpret. So I don't care how you do the math. It just isn't enough time. Are you going to teach ethics in 1 hour? In 30 minutes? Client education? Is that even going to be in the program? I haven't seen one 40-hour program that really teaches simultaneous interpreting, yet it's needed in the field. Sight translation is skimmed through. And yet, it's a very important skill in real life medical interpreting. Every day I had to do some site translation in some way. So I don't know. I mean, I really hope I convinced you, but if I haven't, I am not going to give up. So why aren't they increasing the hours? It could be easy, right? You would be able to charge more. You would improve your program. You would be able to breathe and teach all the curriculum you want within the time frame that is adequate for that. But the reason they don't expand, or in my book, there are two reasons. The first one, overselling. We are definitely being sold the idea that, you can become a professional in 40 hours. Now, really, do you really, really, really believe that there's any profession you can learn in 40 hours? I don't know. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of any other profession doing that. So it's a hard sell, but for someone who wants a job and who wants a profession, easy. It really is an incredibly, how can I say, attractive message, right? It's attractive. And many people are taking the bait. And nobody's watching. Unless you're accredited, you're not audited, you can say whatever you want. We have court interpreters teaching medical interpreting. I'm sorry, but unless you're specialized, unless you're trained, and you should be certified, how do I know that I'm learning from someone that actually has the skills and knowledge? Or the practice? The IMI accreditation standards actually has accreditation standards for the instructors, for everybody involved in teaching interpreting. If you're teaching medical terminology, you don't have to be an interpreter, but if you're teaching consecutive medical interpreting, I don't know how you could do that without having actually practiced medical interpreting. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is CCHI and the National Board, the two entities that are for spoken language certification, they're not requiring more than 40 hours, right? So if they don't require it, there's no incentive to change. There is absolutely no incentive. Actually, there's an incentive not to change it, because how are you going to offer a 100-hour program and compete with a 40-hour program? A 100-hour program is going to cost more. Right? So very few organizations are doing that, and they're fighting the fight. But frankly, a lot of people are like, 100 hours, 40 hours. I'm just going to go 40 hours. I really don't need 100. I can get certified. What they don't know is that a lot of times they're taking the certification exam and they're not passing, right? They're not passing. The written exam has a higher passing rate, but the oral exam, you can't expect to be able to pass the exam just because you did 40 hours. So to me, those are the reasons why we really do have to see that, why this isn't changing. And that tells us what we need. We need to be more vigilant about the advertising, about the programs, and we need the certification entities to actually, step it up. It's about time. It's been 10 years. When are we going to do it? It's been 11 years, actually. Right? It's time. So what action can you take? Well, you can discuss this issue in your working circles. You can create a post or a meme on social media. You can share this presentation with others and on social media. Please do. Go ahead. Share whatever you want. You can push for a bachelor degree or equivalent requirement if you believe in that. You can push for verifiable language proficiency before training. These training companies are not verifying language proficiency at all. And they have a conflict of interest. And unfortunately, people are getting trained, and then when they go get certified, they find out they have to take a proficiency exam, and they don't pass. So it's not even that they can't even take the certification exam, because they don't have the fluency. But nobody told them, oh, just register in my course. You speak 2 languages? Fantastic. So we really, especially the language neutral, it's very difficult to find out. I can claim I speak 10 languages, but How many do I really speak, right? Or am I fluent in, or am I proficient? So you can also write to your training program. I have a little example here. And you can, basically go look at the list. You can send it to where you were trained or any other training organization. And you can ask them to increase their programs to 100 hours, 200, whatever you want. This is just a sample. And you can also ask them to include a practicum if you want. And you can say, we can get paid better. We cannot get paid better with such low requirements. This is hurting the profession. I know it's a hard thing to say, but the reality is that our pay grade is completely attached to the requirements to practice. So until we have these requirements raised, and ultimately, believe me, I really hope next year I can start advocating for the certification requirement, because that is what's going to protect our profession. If certification is required, and that will only happen if, we have a certain outcome in the election, and we can start fighting for it. And I'll start going back to DC. But right now, we don't know what's going to happen. So you can also write to the certifying bodies. This one actually even is more important than the training organizations, because the day CCHI and NBCMI increase the standards, and they could do it by 2025. They could announce this year that by 2025, interpreters are going to need 100-hour training. If they do that, they give plenty of time for training organizations to adjust. And then you won't even have to write that other letter, because the training organization is going to get the memo, get the picture, and start doing it. And you know what? Everybody wins. Interpreters get better trained. The training programs can charge more. They can finally teach 3 hours of ethics instead of 1. The instructors can breathe. The instructors can include things that they've always wanted to include. So everybody wins. Even language companies win, because interpreters will be better trained. Liabilities go down. And maybe they can charge more. Who knows? But we know we'll be closer to being a profession than we are right now. Okay? So there is something you can do, and we need everybody. We need everybody to take action. I can't be the only one fighting this fight. I need you. I need every interpreter, especially the certified interpreters. You owe it to your profession to not let it go downhill because of low denominator benchmarks. Let's change this together, okay? So, what does this have to do with being a hero? Well, that is the beautiful theme of this event, and that's why I thought of this particular topic. We are all heroes. We are doing, we're essential workers, basically, doing really hard work. Without us, healthcare justice doesn't happen. We're not helping folks communicating. We're enabling professionals to do their work. We're enabling individuals to access services. Everybody needs us. So let's all do our part to improve the working conditions, the pay, the recognition of our difficult and specialized work. Okay, can I count on you to do at least one action? I really hope so. I really hope I pumped you up. I hope that you have the passion I have for advancing the profession. One thing alone is not going to do it. We really need to keep moving forward. And believe me, I will not stop until national certification is a requirement for practice. So thank you so much. This is the end of the presentation. You can check out my blog. I actually wrote a small paper on this. You can schedule a quick call with me if you want to, discuss it further. I'm very happy to do this, and I really appreciate, our time together. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.